Hello everybody, as said, I'm Gergely, environmental chemist at Pesticide Action Network. And as I've seen that so many presentations focus on the general pollution of our waters, I try to focus exclusively on pesticides, as that's my main topic. I have experience in other chemical pollution of waters, but I think I use this opportunity to focus on pesticides. First, I will say a few words about how we see that pesticides are polluting our waters. Then I would give some specific examples. Then I will talk a few words about the legislative framework and how I believe it's not fulfilled. And then I say that how we would like to improve it and where do we see that the Hungarian presidency or the European institutions would have the chance to improve the situation. Pesticide Action Network is a global organization and the European branch is based in Brussels. I work for them from Hungary, but we have several colleagues covering different topics, but mainly it's an expert organization focusing on pesticides. So here is some data about how pesticide already polluted basically all of our waters all around Europe. There's a German example that 60% of the sampling points pesticide or metabolites has reached the groundwater already. In Netherlands, they found that 65% of the surface water samples contained 30 or more different kind of insecticides. Of course, if we use very sensitive analytical methods, basically you cannot take any surface water samples, or it's really hard to take where you don't see residues of pesticides. What I think is a big gap in the whole European framework is that very few active ingredients are being monitored under the EU Water Framework Directive, and we see that the monitoring efforts really lag behind the introduction of new pesticides. I will tell a bit more about that later on. And the monitoring really focuses on single substances, but in reality what we see if we look at the water sample, the active ingredients, co-formulants made to formulate the pesticide product, metabolites, and of course many different other chemicals, and of course even microplastics and other different pollutions. Here is just a quick statistics from the environmental agency, European Environmental Agency, about threshold. For a few chemicals there are environmental quality standards, and already in some years 25% of the water bodies tested were above the thresholds for these few chemicals, few pesticides, where there is a threshold already. And that groundwater also there was an 4 to 11% detection of pesticides. But I think it's of course up to analytical methods. But just giving you an example, if we look at, for instance, more sensitive methods, Greenpeace in Hungary in 2014 completed a test for surface and drinking water samples, and in all samples pesticides were detected, and there was, for instance, a sample from the Danube River at Győr, it's near the Slovak and Austrian border, and 11 different kind of pesticides were detected. So why we think it's a big problem that that pesticides pollute the aquatic ecosystems. Already we made a poll with Ipsos, with Pan-Europe in 2022, and we found that actually 80% of the Europeans asked in this poll think that already pesticides are damaging the environment, and they believe that the pesticides we are using are dangerous for the ecosystem. But I think I don't have to explain to this audience that the freshwater ecosystems are really rich in minerals, nutrients, giving life space to live for a lot of habitat, and they have a very sensitive interaction, and of course they provide a lot of ecosystem services. And all these organisms and us humans really depend on the quality of water. And if you use, and if pesticides, chemicals which are actually made to kill, you know, because that's the purpose, that's why they are produced and that's how they developed, are released into the ecosystem, they obviously will cause a lot of damages. And we know that the current pesticide use lead to an unacceptable biodiversity loss and a lot of damages to our ecosystems. I'll give you one example of glyphosate, because we have been working on the Stop Glyphosate campaign for quite a while, and this is the most widely used pesticide. It's a herbicide in Europe, and it has been classified as being toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effect. And there's a lot of scientific studies explaining that already the concentration we found in the environment are damaging a lot of species, and especially during the vulnerable early life stage. Like we know there's a lot of study how tadpoles of amphibians are already very, very highly damaged by the concentration we found in the environment. And I think in the whole European legislation, it's always a kind of discussion, and I think a gap, that which is a relevant metabolite. And the main metabolite of glyphosate, AMPA, is not a relevant metabolite for drinking water and groundwater at EU level. For surface water, now they consider it as a relevant metabolite, but still it's not regulated. And we know that AMPA is more persistent, and EFSA even stated in the 2023 report that it has a similar toxicological profile as glyphosate and similarly poses a risk to aquatic environment. Of course, I know that AMPA has other sources, like the degradation product of surfactant could be also AMPA, but that's not a reason for having it as a non-regulated substance in our waters. In 2022, with Pesticide Action Network, we made a monitoring all around Europe in 12 countries, in Hungary and France, Spain, Portugal, all over. And we basically found AMPA in almost the majority, the 3/4 of the samples. Only in Slovenia we didn't detect AMPA, and we find glyphosate in 5 countries. But we had quite high detection level, only 0.2 microgram per liter, which is like double than the drinking water limit. But other statistics, monitoring data shows that actually if you look glyphosate with a lower concentration, you will find it much wider in our waters. I know that there was a recent study claiming that the source of AMPA is possibly surfactants, but that doesn't explain why we have glyphosate all over, and the tens of tons of glyphosate which being released to all of the waters of Europe are still causing an unacceptable damage. And of course, we know that glyphosate causes a lot of other harm to the environment and to human health, as is, being a potential cause for cancer. Then I give you another example from another fresh pen study, another example of an unregulated part of pesticides, because the EU chemical strategy basically committed to phase out perfluorinated chemicals, but pesticide active substances are left out from the proposal, and we know that perfluorinated pesticides are direct and intentional source of fast pollution all over Europe. Also, PEN made an analysis for that in 2024. 23 surface water and 6 groundwater samples were taken from 10 EU countries, also from Hungary, and all the water samples contained PFAS, and more than 98% of the PFAS was actually TFA. It's a degradation product of pesticide, but also F gases are fluorinated gases metabolized to TFA. And 79% of the samples had the TFA level higher than the proposed EU drinking water directive limit. There is no surface water limit, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, Mr. Shimon, can you please unpack these acronyms, PFAS, TFA?
Okay. PFAS, sorry, is perfluorinated alkyl substances. They are the kind of forever chemicals, they called, which are really slowly degrading the environment and persist for long time. And TFA is I have the chemical in front of me. It's like it's a single. It's a degradation product. It's like a single small molecule of perfluorinated substances, and that's what we detected most often. It contains only I think it's 1 or 2 carbon. It's TFA. I can check in a second. But what's important is that TFA is a non-relevant metabolite under the EU pesticide regulation, and that's why it's hindered in the groundwater protection of the European Union. For TFA, there is very few studies available, and there is 2 new studies showing that it have a chronic and reproductive toxicity similar to the well-known PFAS, but these studies show that it appears only at higher concentrations. So what we found TFA concentrations now are probably within the safety limits, but due to the limited toxicity data, we possibly underestimate the risk, and many PFAS are considered as a non-threshold chemicals, which means that there is not any low concentration which could be considered as a safe level. And TFA inputs are increasing day by day. And of course, we could say that our safety buffer limit is limited. So we should make further steps, to stop this TFA concentration. And what I just said, that there is no limit for TFA in surface water, groundwater, and drinking water. From 2026, there is a proposal for a total PFAS concentration in the drinking water for 0.5 microgram. We believe that by definition TFA should be there, but we are not sure if this is the case. And half of the tap water samples we took were above this 500 nanogram per liter. And member states can choose if they want to use this PFAS total, and we know that, for instance, several countries like Germany and even Hungary don't implement this value. We believe that the revision of the EU Water Framework Directive, which is happening, the trialogue in the upcoming period, opens opportunities still to have EQS for TFA. But we believe that the EU Framework Directive, as it is now, should have already prevented such pollution, because such chemicals shouldn't have been released to the environment at all. So what PEN demands related to PFAS is basically an immediate ban for PFAS pesticides and F-gases, and implement a general PFAS restriction according to REACH, and establishing safe drinking water limits both for surface water environmental quality standards and for drinking water for TFA. And of course, we should think that farmers should be supported to replace PFAS pesticides. Of course, we would like with non-chemical alternative and with IPM, but in the worst case, at least with safer chemicals. So after giving these 2 examples of glyphosate and PFAS pesticides, I would like to say a few words about some legislation related to the regulation, to the legislative framework of pesticide in our waters, and why we believe they are not properly implemented. First, the most important legislation is in relation to pesticide is the 1107/2009, the EU pesticide law, which actually acknowledges that the use of pesticide can cause a lot of harm to human health and to the environment. So, they set strict rules for authorization, and of course active substances, pesticides, can only be approved if it's demonstrated that the use do not adversely affect human or animal health or the environment, do not harm biodiversity or the ecosystem, and do not cause contamination in surface waters. So we have a really perfect framework which is supposed to protect our health and our waters and our environment from pesticides. And the legislation says that toxicity of not only the active ingredient, but the pesticide product, so with the coformulants, and also the metabolites should be assessed. And what also should be, there is a safety net should be around the residues on food, drinking water, and environment. So we have a really good framework, but in reality, for instance, we know that currently a lot of pesticides are approved on EU level, which are known to be toxic to aquatic environment. You see that there is more than 100 active substances. Safe and synergies are classified to aquatic toxic, and almost 100 as chronic toxic. And in principle, they should not reach, water bodies, but in reality, if we do a water test, we always find these chemicals, these pesticides in waters. And also for the whole assessment, we believe that there are very outdated and very industry-friendly guidelines because there are principles that we should not authorize pesticide toxic to environment, whatever, to non-target arthropods, whatever. But the guidelines are so outdated and so industry-friendly that in reality, we have so many pesticides on the market which can be criticized by scientists and health experts and environment and experts for being really toxic to human health and to the environment. Then the next piece of legislation where our EB colleague Sarah will talk in much more details, also supposed to protect our waters from pesticides. And I already mentioned the environmental quality standard legislation, where I already mentioned that very, very few pesticides are actually being obliged to be monitored, and very few substances are having environmental quality standards. And of course, we know that the new European Commission proposal, which is under discussion, proposes mainly banned substances to be monitored. And of course, it's really important to know how the banned substances are still in our waters. And I know a lot of examples that still atrazine and metolachlor and all this, and even DDT are quite often found in our waters. But we believe that monitoring needed for the currently authorized active substances is needed, and many approved substances, as I said, are of concern of aquatic life, and many of them are not within the priority list substances, and I give you a few examples here. And it's not accepted yet, but the European Commission also introduced total threshold limit for pesticides, and for metabolites, but we see that there are some concrete examples like glyphosate and atrazine from the past, which are having higher EQS than the total, and we think it's really unacceptable. For drinking water and groundwater, we have 0.1 general for individual and 0.1 from total substances. But we see that a lot of metabolites are not considered as relevant metabolites, and I think this is we think it's really an issue that they should be more properly assessed. And of course, the cocktail effects are not considered. And in reality, we see that as the cocktail effects are not really taken into consideration, when we take a drinking water sample, what we already did, for instance, sometimes in Hungary, we often find 10, 12 different kind of pesticides in our drinking water, and with the other chemicals being present in the drinking water, we can consider it as a significant risk. Then coming to the sustainable use of pesticide directive, it also takes into consideration that aquatic environment is sensitive to pesticides and requests member states to set measures to prevent pollution. They should establish buffer zones, but we really believe that and safeguard zones, that these safeguard zones and buffer zones are really not enough. We see that the overall enforcement of the directive to reduce pesticide use and protect vulnerable ecosystems and population is really weak. It's really not happening well. And Commission also acknowledged that, and that's why they proposed the sustainable use regulation, the SUR, which is supposed to be a legally binding instrument, but you might know that the SUR has been withdrawn by the Commission. And I'm coming to this part, that the pesticide use reduction was already requested earlier in the Sustainable Use Directive, and it was basically not really enforced. But the Farm to Fork strategy, the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, all demanded a 50% reduction by 2030 with a focus on protecting ecosystems and improving biodiversity. And since the SUR was withdrawn, now it's really up to EU decision makers to decide how this obligation will be fulfilled, if it will be a new legislation, or they will properly implement the old directive, which was, we believe, never properly enforced. Okay, I'm just coming to my conclusions. So what we believe are the opportunities to strengthen EU law and its implementation. We see that beside there are lot of really good EU legislation which could protect our waters from pesticides. Still a lot of toxic substances on the market which are toxic to aquatic environment. Our surface water and groundwaters are still contaminated with cocktails of pesticides. And monitoring should follow emerging pollutants. The Water Framework Direct Trialogue and the new soil monitoring law is a good opportunity to, to cover this and make a progress in this. Cocktail effects, oh sorry, it's misspelled, should be adequately considered. Outdated industry-friendly guidelines should be really renewed and updated. It has been promised for a long time for a lot of guidelines, but it's really not happening. Only the big guidelines were being properly or a bit better updated. Metabolites, non-relevant metabolites, co-formulants should be properly regulated. We see a lot of gaps in this legislation. And of course, pesticide use reduction should be happening. Introduction of IPM, non-chemical plant protection, as required by the previous legislation and by the new Green Deal strategies, should be properly implemented. Thanks very much.